Hi everyone, Nigel Saunders here. Today's video is kind of a special video. It's number 50. I've been making a video every day for the last 50 days. So today is the 50th video. And I think we'll do something special today. I'm going to go back in time to my very first bonsai, my Ficus microcarpa, and I'm going to work on it. In fall, I brought a lot of my trees into the basement, my tropical trees, where they were chilling in the basement. It's very cool. I did put up some grow lights above them. And I'm slowly bringing them all up into the plant room here. The temperature outside is getting cooler, and we're kind of into midwinter, so I don't want the plants in the basement to get too cold. So I'm slowly bringing them upstairs and working on them. So that's one of the reasons I've been doing 50 videos in a row, is to get all my plant work done and caught up. Here's a view of the trees in the basement. So I've got quite a few still. Last night the temperature got down to 6.2 degrees Celsius down here. So it's getting kind of cool. I don't want to leave these trees down here much longer. I'll eventually be bringing them all upstairs. This is the tree I'll be working on today. My very first bonsai, a Ficus microcarpa that I grew from seed. The last time that I did any work to my very first bonsai, my Ficus microcarpa, was in midsummer, early August, and I kind of pruned back the canopy, getting rid of all the long shoots and the vigorous shoots, kind of equalizing the balance of vigor in the canopy of the tree. Today I'll be bringing the tree out of dormancy, bringing it up into the plant room here, and I'm going to really study the structure of the tree, defoliate the tree, and prune it back. I want beautiful branches on this tree, so it's going to be quite a detailed video, about pruning the upper structure. I've got my ficus up into the plant room now, where it'll be warmed up for the first time in about 3 months, and I think it'll grow with a lot of vigor. Even in the basement at a maximum temperature of about 9 degrees Celsius, there is still new shoots growing on the tree, so they can grow in those cool conditions. They just don't grow with much vigor. When the trees are dormant in the basement in those cool temperatures, there's no insects to worry about. You don't have to water them very often, and they don't grow, so you don't have to worry about pruning them. So it's an easy way to get your tropical trees through most of the winter. My goal for this tree is to make it look like a miniature version of a giant ficus tree that you'd see in nature. So all the little details that make it look like a miniature tree are really important to get that sense of scale and make this small tree look like a giant tree. To make a small tree look like a giant tree you'd see in nature, it's all about the details, the root structure, the trunk, the bark, the branches, and these things all combine to create the illusion of a miniature tree. Here's a look at the branch structure under the canopy, and you can see the branches are quite long and thin. They don't have a lot of movement or taper or change of direction. This tree has a nice large umbrella-shaped canopy, and it looks quite impressive, but I want to improve the branch structure that's kind of hidden inside the canopy, improving all the branches. So I'm going to switch to the whiteboard, and I'll explain, what's wrong with this tree and how I can improve it for the future. You'll hear a lot of people talk about, quality bonsai. It's not the size of the tree that counts, it's the quality of the tree. And you'll hear that term a lot, There's one tree that's a better quality than another. But a lot of people don't explain, well, what does that mean, the quality of a tree? So I'll try and explain this. And I think it'll be a long explanation, but I think it's worth talking about. What makes a quality tree? Well, there's a lot of elements. One, we'll say the pot. 2, the roots. 3, the trunk. 4, the branches. And 5, the leaves. So there's 5 elements that contribute to making a quality tree. So what makes a quality tree? Well, the pot. How does that make a quality tree? I would say the beauty of the pot, matching the pot with the tree. And I would say the style of the pot. So, you know, these are all related, but maybe the quality of the pot. Quality is something maybe hard to see, but we can, you know, quality is also part of a beautiful pot. Patina is also part of a beautiful pot. So basically, to me, you know, bonsai is a tree in a pot or a plant in a pot, and the two have to be in balance. You don't want the pot overpowering the tree. You don't want the tree overpowering the pot. The two have to live in harmony. So when you look at the bonsai, your eye isn't drawn to one element over another. It's not drawn to the tree. It's not drawn to the pot. It's drawn to the overall picture of the tree in the pot. And matching, you know, the perfect pot with the perfect tree, it's difficult. Most people don't have 200 pots to choose from to try it out and find out which looks the best. So I think something like Photoshop helps a lot. You can kind of Photoshop in a number of different style pots and colors and sizes of pots in Photoshop, and you can kind of see what looks best on the tree. So thank goodness for Photoshop, because, you know, most people just don't have those resources to call up even 20 different pots to try out with their tree. So roots. How do roots contribute to the quality of a tree? Well, they have to be kind of radial, if that's your aim. There's exceptions to all these rules. You know, if you have a tree growing over a rock, well, you know, they're not going to be that radial, but that's one element. Balance is important. Balance. You don't want the roots on one side of a tree being, you know, if this is your trunk cross section, you don't want a big thick root on this side of the tree and little skinny ones on this side. You know, this root is out of balance with the rest of them. You want them fairly balanced. And, you know, you don't want it perfectly balanced, but within reason. You want them all kind of a similar shape and also a similar style. You don't want, when I talk about style of root, you don't want, you know, roots with all these movement and fine divisions, and then you don't want one root that just comes out straight like that with no movement, no taper, no ramification. So, yeah, so balance in the root system is important. What else is important? Well, bark, age and bark. So the bark of the root system. Younger roots have no bark on them. They're kind of fleshy looking. You want the roots to, the surface roots to kind of blend in with the texture of the tree. You want them to look as old as the tree is, as old as the bark on the trunk. So that's another thing that can make roots look good. There's the radial, balance, bark. There's the style of the root or the shape. Let's say style. Let's say style. It's maybe not the perfect word, but, and what do I mean by the style of a root? Well, here's your trunk, you know, your cross section of your trunk. A root can have different styles. I've already pointed out the one that comes straight out from the trunk. No ramification, no movement. That's one style of root. Another style of root is one that comes out and it's curvy and it continues to curve. Sort of an octopus style, or a root with lots of movement. There's a root, they can be straight, but they have ramification, so they ramify. And they ramify. And they ramify again. And again, and again. So, very short internodes between ramification. Good subdivision. Just like the branches of your tree. You don't want these long straight branches on your tree, and you probably don't want long straight roots. So there's, 3 different styles of roots. So that kind of covers this style. I've covered the bark. You want the bark on the tree trunk and the bark on the roots to match, to look as equally as old. You'll often see, a tree that's been air layered, and it has these new looking roots coming out from the air layer, and you'll kind of get a bulge around where it was air layered. And, it takes a lot of years for an air layered tree before the bark on the trees, on the roots, match the bark on the trunk. So, a lot of years to get that to match. That's why I'm not a big fan of air layering, because, if you have a really old trunk with all these plates of bark on it and you air layer the tree, you get these soft, fleshy roots coming out. And they're usually very straight, so it takes a lot of years before you prune them and get movement and ramification to them. So, yeah, air layering, you get these new-looking roots and a very old trunk on the tree, and it takes a long time before the two kind of equalize and become balanced. So we've talked about style, we've talked about bark, balance. Balance, we talked about that a little bit. I talked about, your trunk, you don't want one root to be really thick and the other's really thin. You want, basically an equal balance to the roots. So they're all kind of, they don't have to be exactly the same thickness going all the way around, but they have to be within reason. If you study an old tree, I've seen old trees that do look like this. They've got, a fairly even distribution of roots around the trunk, and then you get one big thick one. And it kind of, and you get kind of the trunk, instead of being round, you get this big kind of bulge in that area because it's got so much living tissue coming up. There's always exceptions to every rule, but generally you want a balanced root system. Another thing is the number of surface roots. I count surface roots on trees. When I see a tree I like in nature, I go around and I count how many surface roots you see on the tree. And generally, most trees, you'll see about 12 to about 20 surface roots. If you get too many, it doesn't look right. If you have too few, it doesn't look right. So, if you have a tree that's just bursting with surface roots all the way around, and I see this a lot, too many, what happens is as they grow, they all fuse into each other, and then you get this kind of a plate-like effect with your roots. And you see that in nature sometimes, but not that often. Not around here anyway. You also don't want too few roots. If this is your trunk of your tree, you don't want, 3 surface roots, because it's not going to look very miniature. So, that's part of a quality root system, is getting, those 12 to 20 kind of surface roots in balance, radial. And that'll make a nice miniature looking root base to a tree. I talked about radial. Well, we've done balance here. Radial. So a root system, you don't want roots coming off the trunk like this and dividing. You want them, if this is the center of your tree, you want them coming out in a nice radial pattern. You don't want them, you can. It's a style if you want them all kind of coming off the trunk twisty. There's nothing wrong with it. But generally, most trees in nature, the roots kind of grow out in a radial pattern from the center of the trunk. And like I said, there's exceptions to every rule. If you want to design a root system that looks like a saw blade, where every root is kind of coming off at an angle, well, there's nothing stopping you doing it. It's just, you won't see that effect in nature very often. And, when I say, you want that perfect radial root base, you're never going to get it. It's something, you're working with plants. So, you know, you might have two roots really close to each other in a space. You might have one that comes out on a bit of an angle. You try and do the best you can with your root system, but you don't, you know, a lot of people will graft roots in. If there's no root here, well, I've got to graft one in. And they're trying to perfect an imperfect root system. They're trying to perfect something that's imperfect. And trees are, they're not mathematical objects. They grow in very random, you know, manner. You don't always get a perfect radial root system on even the most mature trees you'll see in nature. So I try and work with what I have. I don't like grafting in roots and trying to fix your root base to the 9th degree. I like to work with what I have and try and make the best of the root system the tree has and try and work on it towards, you know, improving it in the future. So that covers radial roots. So that covers roots in general. So next we've got the trunk of the tree. So what makes a quality trunk on a tree? Well, you know, you'll hear a lot about, well, if you have a trunk of a tree, well, it can't have any scars on it. It's got to be flawless. And, you know, I've looked at trunks in nature, and sure, an older tree, you know, a young tree starts off as a young tree and it has branches all over it. You know, and then as it grows into a mature tree like this, all these branches have little scars on the tree where they were. They never go away totally, but they become hidden features eventually. You know, eventually a branch scar, the trunk of the tree, you get the bark on it, and those little scars heal. Trees in nature, I mean, sometimes they do lose a big lower branch and you'll get a cavity here. There's nothing wrong with a cavity as long as it's healed over. It matches the age of the tree and tells a story. You don't want this, you know, fresh wound on a show tree. If you've just pruned a branch off and it's fresh wound, there's no callousing, well, that doesn't give the impression of age. It takes it away. It just shows that something was recently removed from the tree. So if you are going to have, you know, a trunk with features on it, they have to look old. They have to be calloused over. It has to match the age of the tree and tell a story. So I'm not against trees with, you know, flaws in the trunk, if you call them flaws, like pruning wounds and that. As long as they've healed over and they calloused over and they fit in with the character of the tree, I think they look fine. What else is a quality tree trunk? Well, taper is one thing. Generally in nature, you know, a tree tapers from the bottom. It gets thinner as it goes up to the top. So you don't want, you know, your tree trunk to do the opposite. It would look funny. So generally, you know, taper is very important. You can have too much taper. And this is perhaps my opinion, but if I have a tree that's, and it depends on the type of the tree too. If I have a tree that comes up like this and then I have a canopy on it. If that's a ficus tree, well, yeah, that's fine because that's generally how they grow in nature. If this is a maple tree, for instance, I've never seen a maple tree that looks like that in my life other than a bonsai maple. So yeah, you can have too much taper for a particular species of a tree. I think, you know, I've always been a believer that the bonsai tree should look like the full-size counterpart in nature or have the characteristics of that full-size tree in nature. So yeah, if this is, you know, a maple or a pine, you know, I don't see pine trees with these big exaggerated trunks like that. You see a lot of black pines that are, you know, look like this, and the root base is huge, short, squat tree. I don't know. I don't see those kind of trees in nature. Maybe they exist somewhere, but generally, to me, that doesn't look like a tree. It's got too much taper to the trunk. So I'm going to say that, you know, a trunk, what makes a good trunk? Well, taper, reasonable taper too. The bark. So an old tree, it gets bark, and there's a lot of different kinds of bark. To me, the best tree is a tree that's slowly grown in a pot all its life. And you'll find, you know, on these slowly grown trees, the little plates of bark are so miniature, it looks very, very convincing as a miniature tree. If a tree's grown rapidly, you know, you take the same tree, same species, the plates of bark are larger. You know, and it just, if a tree's grown rapidly, you get these, the outer layer of the bark starts cracking, and if it's rapidly grown, they crack quickly in big cracks. A tree that's grown slowly in a pot, as it grows larger, these cracks in the bark happen over many, many years. It takes a long time to get a bark texture, but when you do get it, it's very miniaturized, and there's no substitute for that. That's part of quality bark on a tree. So your tree has to be slowly grown to get that miniature kind of bark. And it's just something, if you see it, it's wonderful, this kind of bark. It's almost magical because it looks so miniature. So yeah, so now a lot of people talk about, you know, movement on a trunk. You know, I see a lot of people, oh, that trunk's got movement to it. It's fantastic. What a lucky find and all this. That's one style of tree. You can also have a trunk that is perfectly straight, and there's no difference in quality. This can be a quality tree just as much as a straight trunk. Having curves and movement in a trunk doesn't increase the quality of a tree. It just is a different style. So I see a lot of people, you know, they have a straight trunk tree and they think, that's no good. I can't have a straight tree. I've got to put curves in it. Well, then you're changing the style of the tree. You're not changing the quality of the tree. A straight trunk tree can have just as much or more quality as one with curves in it. And so, yeah, so we can't put trunk movement onto the trunk because that's not a quality feature. It's just a style feature. So I'm going to take movement off. So what else makes a quality trunk? Well, when a tree's young and you take a cross section of it, it's perfectly round. The cambium layer is a thin layer around the tree, which is perfectly round. You'll see all the rings will be perfectly round on the inside, the growth rings. It's all round. As a tree grows larger, you know, as these little thin roots that feed the tree start to thicken up. So let's go down to an older tree here. And I'm going to draw it as a circle first. Okay, you can't see that. Hold on. I'm going to change it. I got to draw up here. So here's our circular, an older tree. And the roots have grown in. They're getting thick. So, you know, instead of thin little roots, they're starting to get thick surface roots. And what happens is the flow of, you know, water, nutrients come from the roots and they come up the tree, and they start to get bulges on the trunk where these roots connect and go up to the surface or the top of the tree, the canopy. So if we look at the side view, here's our surface root. It comes up the trunk, and if you picture this as a canal or a pathway for your water flow and nutrient flow, so they start developing. So you start getting kind of bulges around the trunk of the tree. So it's not perfectly round anymore. And you'll see this, you know, at the base of the tree, you'll get this, it's called a fluted trunk. And you get all these ridges going up the tree. So instead of being perfectly round, if we take a cross section right through here, instead of being perfectly round, it's more this shape where it's kind of fluted. And, you know, it won't be perfect like this. There may be some big ones and some smaller ones. It all depends on your root structure. So that is an element of a quality trunk on a tree when it gets that kind of age. And a young tree won't get that, and an older tree will. I know they call this vascular tissue. Let's call it the live veins. Veins, how do you spell veins? Veins, yeah. The live veins. So that's what I'm talking about here, is these canals or these transport systems for the to the roots to the canopy of the tree. So, you know, these nutrients flow up and into the branches. So, you know, you've got your root, your trunk, and your branches. So it's one system of circulating nutrients through the tree. And on an older tree, they swell up and they get larger, and your trunk goes out of round. And it's a desirable feature. It makes the trunk look much older. So what else can make a trunk look older? Well, deadwood. On a trunk that has, you know, it depends a lot on the tree species in that. You know, if it's a juniper, generally in nature, you know, they live in a harsh environment and you get maybe dead sections of the deadwood. But again, I wouldn't consider that a quality trunk. This is more of a style choice. You could grow a juniper and try and make it look young and vigorous, or not young and vigorous, but you could grow a juniper and try and make it look like a really old tree. Not every juniper has deadwood on it. I would say most do somehow. You know, most trees get damaged somehow in their life, especially if they're old trees. But I wouldn't say deadwood's a kind of a different category. You know, there's a lot of different qualities of deadwood. There's natural deadwood. There's usually, you know, the best deadwood is off a tree that's been collected, that's been slowly grown over 100 years or so. You know, if you have a dead branch here and there's 100 different rings of growth in the branch, well, that deadwood's going to look very miniature and very natural on a bonsai tree. If you have deadwood that's, you know, it's a young branch that's 5 years old, you've got 5 growth rings in the branch. And when you peel the bark off and make the tree into deadwood, it's not going to look, you know, this 5-year-old branch isn't going to look like a 100-year-old branch. And that's a difference in quality, that this is going to look immature and this is going to look mature and miniature. So I'm not going to get into deadwood much because it doesn't apply to, it's sort of one specific section of bonsai that it's a specialist category, because, you know, deadwood, there's quality of deadwood, there's natural looking deadwood, there's artificial deadwood, and it's kind of a different subject, but it can be part of a quality trunk. So I'll say live veins and I'll say dead veins. Really good quality deadwood like this is valuable to the tree, and it's part of a quality trunk on a tree, and it'll go the same for branches. So today I'm going to be doing branch pruning on this tree. So this is a major category that I'll be dealing with today, is branches and quality branches. So let me rub this out. And I'm trying to think if I missed anything in the trunk. We've got taper, bark, live veins, possibly deadwood. There's things like aerial roots, you know, aerial roots coming off the trunk. But again, I would put that in the same category as deadwood. Not every tree has aerial roots, and, you know, there's good aerial roots, there's bad aerial roots, and that's kind of a different subject than today. But there is a difference in quality of aerial roots, and it can affect the quality of the trunk on the bonsai. Our next category is branches, and that's kind of important because that's what I'll be doing today to this tree, is branch pruning. So what makes a quality branch on a tree? Well, a tree, you have the trunk. And that should be the thickest part of the tree. So this is T1. The thickest part of the tree is the trunk. And then off of your trunk you have branches. So your branches should be thinner than the trunk. You don't want your branches to be the same thickness as the trunk, or it looks funny. If you have a branch coming off your trunk, that's the same thickness as the trunk, even though it subdivides and comes out to the canopy profile. It looks funny. It makes the trunk look insignificant, and it just, everything's the same thickness. And it doesn't look like a tree you'd see in nature. So you've got to have a difference in thickness. So that's why I have the trunk is T1, and then the branches coming off are T2. So this is the second thickest part of the trunk, or of the tree, is the branches, at the base of the branches. And then they're going to taper and subdivide as they ramify out to the finest and newest growing tips right at the outer profile of the canopy. So this is new growth. New growth. And this is your oldest growth back here on the branch. Oldest. So you want that taper from your starting thickness here. It's got to taper gradually out to the canopy. So you don't want your branch to do this. You don't want your branch, if this is your starting thickness T2, you don't want it going out to the outer profile of your canopy and then having all your fine branches at the very edge. It's got to taper kind of evenly from the start here to the edge of your canopy. You don't want the big thick branches and then just suddenly pruned off. And that's what a lot of profile pruning will do if you don't do any other type of pruning, is you just keep hacking it to the profile and these branches thicken up and you don't get any taper in the branches. So taper is very important. And again, just like your trunk, you can have too much taper, you can have too little taper. It's got to be kind of just right to look natural. So branches, the number one thing we've got here is taper. Next, I would say the branch style, I guess. Let's go style. Style. I missed that. Style. There. And what do I mean by style? Well, if this is your trunk again, branches can be, every tree has different style branches. And this is part of observing the trees in nature, where, if you're growing a chestnut tree versus a maple tree, they have different style branches in nature. A chestnut tree generally, because of the weight of the chestnuts on it, they tend to curve down. They actually weep because they get all these heavy chestnuts on them every fall, and it affects the shape of the branches. On a young chestnut tree, the branches grow upright. So, the lower branches are more weeping branches, and they can be quite dramatic, and the upper ones are more upright branches. So every tree has a different style of branch on it, and it's kind of nice if you can match the style with the trees you see in nature. So, if it's a juniper, in the desert, it's going to have broken branches, ones that have died off. It's struggling for life, so the growth is very slow, and it looks totally different than a tree that's growing in a lush environment. So your tree has to tell a story, and it has to be consistent. So you don't want, if you've got a nice smooth trunk, well, it shows probably the tree is growing in good conditions and the branches are going to be nice and smooth. You're not going to get a lot of deadwood on a trunk that's beautiful and flowing. So this is kind of getting more into style, but consistency is what I'm after, is that the style of the branches matches the type of the tree. I often see maple trees, styled. Here's the trunk. It grows up with a single leader, and then all the branches are drooping off of it like this. And I've never seen a maple tree that looks like that in nature. You might see one branch doing this, but generally, this is more of a coniferous tree style, or a spruce tree, or a pine. Generally, a maple tree in nature, it grows upright. It's, got branches, and you don't get that single leader on it. They grow, more in a broom style, and so to me, that's kind of a maple tree style. It's not, and so I like to see, maple trees styled like a maple tree you'd see in nature. I don't like to see them styled in these, I don't know, I call them layer cakes, where you've got the trunk, and then you got, the branches coming off in layers. Very horizontal branches. My marker's not drawing. These markers are either working too much. I think it's because it's wet. Yeah. My cloth is too wet. Hold on. Yeah, so, when you see an overall maple, still not drawing, this kind of horizontal style to it, to me, that doesn't look like a maple. A maple should be reaching up. It's okay to have the branch tips horizontal, but the general structure underneath the maple should be like this, not those horizontal branches. And that's my preference, I guess. That's the way I see maples in nature. In Canada here, we see maples bare with no leaves on them for like 7 months of the year. So we see a lot of maple structures, and the typical bonsai maple, I don't see that in nature, and it bothers me that people, they're missing out on the beauty of the maple. When a branch flows up from a tree, I mean, it's beautiful the way everything flows upwards. It's just amazing on a tree, to get these nice flowing structures. And then, as it gets out, it goes horizontal at the branch tips. But all this inner structure, I find those maples you typically see as bonsai, they have the outer shape correct, but they don't have this beautiful inner structure to them. And they're missing out on that. They're, the tree will look the same from the outside, but they just don't have that maple tree structure on the inside. So to me, that is what makes a quality tree, is that this style matches the species. Yeah, so to me, that's what I look for. And like I said, every tree has a particular style to it and a growth pattern, and that's why I do a lot of clip and grow bonsai, because the tree wants to naturally grow in its natural characteristics, so I let them do that. I don't wire these upright branches horizontal. I keep them upright because that's the way they grow in nature. So I think, have we covered style? Maybe. Yeah, so I think we've covered style. If you're growing a weeping willow, you want the branches to look like a weeping willow. If you're growing a maple, I want the branches to look like a maple. So I tell people, is the style too wild? Is it too out of character of the tree? Well, go on the internet or in nature and look at trees of the same species. And if you can find a picture of a juniper that has this great big deadwood section on it, well, yeah, that's a valid style. I mean, that's what happens in nature. If you can find a maple tree with a big hollow trunk and a big wound on it, well, that's a valid style for bonsai, but you don't want to do something that's totally out of character of the tree. So keep that in mind. You want the style to match the species of the tree. What else makes a quality branch? Well, bark is one. Let's go bark. Now, I'm going to get into this fairly detailed, and I'm going to show what happens in nature. So a branch comes up, and it grows, and usually, it flowers at the tip, so then the next year it subdivides, and the next year it subdivides again, and as the branches get longer, it takes more energy to get them to grow. So there's a certain length a tree grows. Every tree in nature will grow to a certain height. You'll see a tree in nature, they get the canopy on them. You don't see shoots coming out of them. There's a certain height a tree will grow to that, and it's limited by, can I get the water up to the branches? This has to happen. It's a mechanical action or a chemical action. And there's a limit. You don't see trees growing forever and continuing growing in height. There's a limit to how high they grow in nature. And part of it may be the limited resources down below. Maybe they just can't get enough water to grow anymore, so they'll stay kind of stunted. But you don't see, generally if you have a canopy on a tree, and it may not be round, it may be, maybe it's kind of irregular shape, but generally you don't see a branch poking out of the canopy and growing like this, because, in nature there's a certain height and size the tree grows to, and it just suddenly won't shoot out a branch and grow twice as long or anything. So what am I saying? Well, I don't know. Kind of got off track there, didn't I? We were at bark. So the bark on a tree, you've got the bark on your trunk, and everything on a tree kind of matches. This is the oldest part of the tree, so you've got the oldest bark. Oldest bark here. And then, your branches at the base, they have old bark. But as they go out to the tips, the bark has to get younger and younger. So finally at your branch tip, you've got pretty well no bark at all, other than smooth bark. So it's got to go from old bark at the base of the branch to very young bark at the tips. And that's important. You don't want this old trunk and very young branches. It's got to blend, and that's something that takes time. So that's one quality to keep in mind, that you want your bark to go from the old to the young at the tips here. And that's just common sense. That's how a tree grows in nature. I'm going to have to use my damn cloth here. In nature, generally branches grow straight. The exception, as they grow longer and they get more foliage, they start to get weight to them. They'll start bending down. But generally, the growth patterns on them, branches, unless it's a contorted type tree, a branch won't grow in a zigzaggy pattern like this, with leaves on it, unless it's a vine or something. There's exceptions. But generally, in nature, the branches grow straight and you get buds on them. And then these buds grow into branches and you get more buds and they subdivide. Growth is pretty angular on a tree. So a good quality tree, with clip and grow, the idea of a branch is you grow it, you clip it, subdivide it, it grows again, subdivides, and that. As this branch gets older, it starts to get curvature to it. Branches tend to smooth out with age, and they get a nice flow to them. And that happens in nature too, that you get, an angular looking branch. Looks very angular when it's young. It's very, like this, all just straight angles. And then as it grows older, it starts to blend. And because a tree, the sap, it always takes the easiest path. So, it doesn't want to go around a 90-degree corner. It wants to make that corner smooth out. So that's how it grows. It takes the easiest path, and that's what grows on the tree. So you get your angular branches become smooth with time. And this is another quality of a tree. And I don't hear a lot of people talking about it. That, at the start of your branch, it's going to be very smooth and flowing. Like this. And then as you get towards the tips, it's going to become more angular. And this happens in nature. This is, if you study a branch, this is what it looks like. It becomes more and more angular towards the tips. So that's a quality, is the, what do I call this? The shape of the branch, maybe? All right, we'll go with shape. The shape of the branch. It's going to start off very smooth and flowing, and then it's going to become more and more angular as it gets towards the tip. So smooth to angular. Angular. Yeah, so that's something on a tree you can look for, is that transition from smooth flowing branches to angular branches at the tip. And that's part of the quality of a branch. What else makes a quality branch? Well, your typical things like ramification. It starts off one branch at the base of the tree, and then it's going to divide, and it's going to divide and divide again. So depending on the style of the tree, a ramification can be part of the quality of the tree, that you've got these subdivisions. And again, just like the smoothness going to the angular branches, ramification or bifurcation, meaning one dividing into two, is going to increase towards the tips. And that's what a tree does in nature. These branches, you might get a division here, and then these divisions should also get tighter as you get to the tips. So, as it goes out to the tip, a branch is going to get more ramification, and the ramification is going to become tighter. So you're going to get larger subdivisions or internodes between your branches at the base, and finer towards the tip. So generally everything in the branch gets finer as it gets towards the outer edge of the canopy. And ramification is part of this. Ramification is something that can be overdone too. There are some trees that are overdone the ramification, and I'll explain how you can overdo the ramification. First, I'll explain how you can underdo the ramification. You can have a tree with a branch, maybe it looks like that. It's got one division, two divisions, maybe three. Not much going on for the branch. If you look at a branch in nature, it probably has more than that. It probably has maybe 10 major branch divisions. So you've got to strike a balance between ramification and too much ramification. You don't want a tree that has ramification coming out of its ears and it just starts to look like a bush where you get too much, and the whole tree is like that. Too many branches, too many ramification, and it just looks like a hedge instead of being a square-shaped hedge with all these branches in it. It just basically looks like a hedge that's shaped like a tree. There's just too much going on. And if you look at nature, there's not a lot of trees that have that kind of density of ramification to them. It's, again, that that difference where you start your branch off fairly simple, and as it goes out towards the tip, it starts to get more and more complicated. And that's where your ramification ends up. It's not, so this is good, it's not a branch that, you know, ramifies so much, and so by the time you get out to the canopy, there's a million little branches, and it can look too much. It can look too heavy and unnatural. So, you know, there's a balance somewhere between too little and too much ramification on your tree, especially on the inner structure. You know, it's fine to have lots of ramification out at the final tips, but it's got to flow the branch from, you know, simple to complex. And it's got to flow. So, you know, your branch starts out nice and simple, your eye can follow along, and then it starts to get more and more divisions, and then it just comes very dense and complex at the tip. So that's how a tree or a branch grows in nature. And, you know, I always try and use nature as my guideline when I come up with, you know, the properties of a quality tree. So we've got branches, taper, style, bark, shape. I guess we could go with location. I mean, each one of these topics here, I'm probably just touching some of them, but location, you know, generally a tree in nature, there's a certain part of trunk. There's always exceptions, you know, there's trees with branches that come right out at the base of the tree. You know, you'll see branches coming really low on old mature trees. But generally, you know, if you studied 1,000 trees, probably 90% of them would have a certain height of trunk with no branches. And that's because, you know, there's no light. You know, once a tree starts getting a canopy up here, this is shaded out, and branches generally die off or don't grow down here. When a tree's young, you know, there's a certain height that a deer or, you know, whatever animal you have will nibble away all the lower branches so that only the ones up high will survive. So there's always a certain height of most trees that you have a trunk. So, you know, you don't want your branches generally starting off really low unless that's the style you're after. So also the location of your branches, if this is a cross section of your trunk, just like the roots, you don't really want branches going off on weird angles, you know, wrapping around your tree. Generally, you want them going in a radial pattern from the trunk, and that's how most branches grow on a tree. They come out in a nice radial pattern off of the trunk. They don't grow on weird angles generally. And again, there's always exceptions to the rules. And, you know, if you're after a really natural looking tree, well, don't make every branch come out perfectly radial from the trunk, just like your roots. You might want one that's kind of coming out on a bit of an angle, or, you know, maybe you want a branch like that every now and then. There's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, there's no nature breaks every rule book there is. Every rule you can come up with, you'll find an exception in nature, and it looks good. It can look quite natural and bring some naturalness to your tree. If you have everything perfect on a tree, well, then it doesn't look very natural usually. So yeah, I shape, and I added location. Location. So another element to branches is still on location, is, you know, where are the thickest branches? Where are they placed? I'm drawing a broom style tree here. Generally on a deciduous tree or a broadleaf tree, anything growing upwards is thicker. So you'll find, if you have a branch coming off, more horizontal off of these ones, they'll be thin. But the upright ones, they become, multi-trunk trees, and they thicken up the fastest. Anything growing straight up will thicken up probably 2 times as fast as a more horizontal branch. So it's something to keep in mind, that if you want a natural looking tree, upright branches are always going to be thicker than horizontal ones. So you'll see, off a more horizontal branch like this, they'll stay quite thin, even though the branch might be quite thick up here. So, that's kind of something to think about for a broadleaf tree. If you're doing a coniferous tree, with a spruce or a pine, generally, these are the first branches to form. Generally, they're the thickest, and it gets thinner as you go up. Generally. Now, there's exceptions. Like, there's a lot of spruce that they grow these cathedral branches that come up beside the main trunk, and they're huge. And that can happen anywhere on the tree. You can have a cathedral branch come up here that'll be way thicker than any of these branches coming off down here. So there's always exceptions. But generally, the first branches to form generally thicken up, and, you get this triangle canopy on the tree, and the lower branches are generally the thickest. But again, there's no hard, fast rule to that. I would say, again, like 90% of the trees you look at in nature will have that characteristic on a coniferous tree, where the lowest branches are the thickest. Leaves. So, quality of leaves. So, what makes quality leaves? Well, I would say the health of them. And this is maybe generally for shows, or when you're displaying your tree. You don't want trees with health issues, with spots on them. If you have a maple leaf, you don't want those fungal spots all over them. You don't want curly, crisp, dry edges on them. You don't want leaves that are malformed, that didn't come out quite right. Things like that. So you want your leaves to look healthy. You want them, when a person looks at your tree, they don't think about disease or death or anything like that. The tree's supposed to inspire them towards life. Again, unless that's your intention, junipers and that, you're thinking about life and death of the tree and the struggle for survival. But things like broadleaf trees, generally you want them to look really healthy. So no disease on the trees, no malformed leaves. Everything should look healthy. Health, leaf size. Here we go. And I'm not talking about the size of the leaves. I don't care if a leaf on a tree, if it's a large leaf tree or if it's a small leaf tree. I'm talking about consistency. So if this is your broadleaf tree canopy, I don't want to see giant leaves up on the apex, and then the weaker branches, I don't want to see little tiny leaves. So it's the difference in size. You want these to be equal. The tree should be equal amounts of vigor all over the trees and the branches. So all the leaves on the tree are healthy, and they're all the same size. And it's something you don't think about a lot, but if you go to a show and you see a tree with really small leaves at the bottom and really large, vigorous leaves at the top, you'll notice it. It looks it looks odd or strange. So an even size leaf all over the tree is what you're after in a quality tree. And I don't care what size leaves they are. If you have giant leaves at the bottom and giant leaves at the top, I don't care. It's the consistency that they're all the same size is what counts on a tree. Yeah, so, if you use that, if you're limiting your bonsai to the leaf size, if you're putting limits that, well, I can't grow that tree because it has too large of leaves, well, then that logic, everyone would be growing trees with little small leaves. And that would be kind of boring. You want to see different species of trees. So, as I said, if I see a bonsai catalpa or a bonsai Norway maple, or what are some other large leaf trees? Some of the oak trees, well, any tree. There's a balance between miniaturizing the leaves and kind of the natural leaf size the tree has. And I don't want to limit the trees I grow as bonsai because it has too large of leaves. You can grow a larger tree. It's about getting that branch structure and that. Also, by that same logic, people who grow shohin bonsai or, very small bonsai, they have a branch and then they might have 3 leaves on the branch. And that represents the branch. And over here, they might have another 3 leaves and a couple of leaves at the top. In this, very small pot that's, the size of your hand is probably this size. And, the leaves look too large for the size of the tree, but they represent the branches with 3 leaves. And it's the same with a large leaf tree. Why would people grow little tiny bonsai when the leaves are out of scale with the tree? Why not grow them all large or medium-sized bonsai so the leaves look smaller in the tree? Well, that's part of the art, is that, getting 3 leaves to look like a full branch. Convincing people that this is a giant tree when it's something you can hold in your hand. That's part of the art and part of the skill of the bonsai grower, is to convince the audience that they're looking at a large tree when it's got 3 branches or 3 leaves on the branch. So it's the same with a large leaf tree. Those large leaves can give the impression of a full branch. And, if it's skillfully done, you can get a large leaf bonsai that looks fantastic, in my opinion. That is some of the elements that make up a quality bonsai tree. I'm sure there's more. That was just kind of thinking off the top of my head, but I'm hoping someday to write a book, a bonsai book, and I'll, list all these features. I'll plan it all out and list them all and write it down and maybe show photographs and examples of good and bad features on a tree. I'm going to try and apply all those, elements to this tree to improve the quality of the tree for the future. So that's what we'll be working on in part 2 of this series, working on my Ficus microcarpa, improving the overall quality of the tree. That's all for today. I'm Nigel Saunders. Thanks for joining me in the Bonsai Zone.